The moment Monkey D. Luffy's heart stopped beating on Laugh Tale, every person carrying the will of D across the world felt it. Not as pain, not as loss, but as awakening. In that instant, as the Straw Hat Captain's lifeless body lay before the true One Piece, something ancient and dormant stirred within the bloodline that had waited 800 years for this moment. Trafalgar D. Waterlaw collapsed in his submarine's operating room, his tattooed hands trembling as visions flooded his mind. Not memories, but inherited knowledge. He saw Joy Boy's true face for the first time, saw the moment the ancient kingdom fell, and understood why his family had been slaughtered in Flavance. The world government hadn't just been eliminating a disease-ridden population. They had been hunting D carriers, terrified that too many in one place might trigger what was now happening across the globe. Marshal D. Teach, the self-proclaimed Blackbeard, screamed in agony aboard his flagship as his stolen devil fruit powers began to rebel against him. The Yami, Yami no Mi and Gura Gura no Mi, fruits never meant to coexist in one body, suddenly recognized their host as something far more dangerous than a mere pirate. His crew watched in horror as dark energy and seismic tremors erupted uncontrollably around him. But Teach's screams transformed into laughter as he realized what this awakening meant. The power he had killed for, schemed for, murdered Whitebeard for. It was nothing compared to what was stirring in his blood now. On a distant island, Jaguar D. Saul felt his giant bones creak not with age, but with purpose. The archaeologist who had saved Robin years ago stood slowly, his massive frame casting shadows that seemed to move independently. Knowledge flooded through him. The true reason the world government had ordered Ohara's destruction, why Robin's mother had died protecting those books, and what the scholars had actually discovered about the Void Century. It wasn't just history they had uncovered. It was a prophecy about this exact moment. But it was on Laugh Tale where the true awakening began. Luffy's crew watched helplessly as their captain lay motionless, his body having paid the ultimate price for reaching the world's greatest treasure. The One Piece sat before them, not gold or jewels, but something impossible to comprehend. It pulsed with the same rhythm that had once beat in Luffy's chest, a heartbeat that seemed to echo across time itself. Then, as tears fell from Zoro, as Ai's and Nami's navigator instincts screamed that they had lost their way forever, Luffy's body began to change. The scar on his chest, the X-shaped mark Akainu had given him at Marineford, started to glow. Not with the warm light of his devil fruit, but with something older, something that predated the very concept of devil fruits. Across the world, every Marine base received the same impossible report simultaneously. Vice Admiral Garp, the hero of the Marines and Luffy's grandfather, had vanished from his cell in Impel Down. Not escaped, vanished. The surveillance Denden Mushi showed him sitting in his chains one moment, and the next, he simply wasn't there. What the Marines didn't report, what they couldn't understand, was that Garp had felt his grandson's death, an awakening through their shared bloodline. The old man who had spent decades suppressing his true nature, who had chosen duty over the call in his blood, finally stopped fighting what he was born to be. The Five Elders' emergency session lasted exactly 17 seconds before they realized their mistake. For 8 centuries, they had hunted the D bloodline, believing they were preventing a catastrophe. They had fed Imu-sama intelligence about every D carrier, had manipulated wars and governments to keep them scattered and weak. But they had misunderstood the fundamental nature of what they were fighting. The will of D wasn't a threat to be eliminated. It was a failsafe, a genetic lock that could only be opened when the world's greatest treasure was finally claimed by someone pure enough to die for it. On Laugh Tale, Luffy's eyes opened, but they weren't the same eyes that had looked upon his crew moments before. They held centuries of accumulated will, the dreams and hopes of every D who had lived and died waiting for this moment. When he spoke, his voice carried echoes of Joy Boy's laughter, of Roger's final words, of Ace's defiant spirit. "I understand now," Luffy said, his straw hat somehow appearing on his head despite having been knocked away in his final battle. "We weren't meant to find the One Piece. We were meant to become it." The treasure before them wasn't something to be claimed. It was something to be inherited, to be carried, to be shared. As Luffy touched it, knowledge flowed not just to him, but through him to every awakened D across the world. They saw the true history, understood their purpose, and realized why the world government had feared them for so long. Law's submarine surfaced near a marine battleship. But instead of firing, he simply stood on his deck as enemy cannons turned toward him. The marine's weapons wouldn't fire. Not because of his devil fruit power, but because the awakened will within him commanded a respect that transcended authority. The marine soldiers, men who had spent their careers following orders, found themselves unable to attack the man whose very presence reminded them why they had first chosen to protect innocent people. Blackbeard's rampage across the New World stopped as suddenly as it had begun. His crew expected him to declare war on the world government, to use his awakened power to seize control of everything. Instead, he began to laugh. Not the cruel laugh of a conqueror, but the genuine laugh of someone who finally understood the joke. The power he had spent his life accumulating was meaningless compared to the responsibility now flowing through his veins. But it was Garp's appearance at the gates of justice that truly announced to the world that everything had changed. The legendary Marine stood alone before the massive fortress, no longer wearing his uniform, no longer bound by the chain of command that had defined his life. When the Marines asked for his orders, he smiled with the same expression his grandson had always worn. "There are no more orders," Garp said, his voice carrying across the water to every ship, every base, every corner of the world where people still believed in justice over law. "There's only the will we were born to carry, and the dreams we were meant to protect." As the sun set on the old world, Luffy stood with his crew on Laugh-Tale, but he was no longer just their captain. He was the inheritor of 800 years of suppressed hope, the living embodiment of freedom itself. The One Piece hadn't been treasure at all. It had been the key to awakening what the D bloodline was always meant to become. And somewhere in the darkness of Pangaea Castle, Imu-sama felt genuine fear for the first time in centuries, because the failsafe they had spent 800 years trying to prevent had finally activated. The will of D was no longer sleeping, and the world would never be the same.